A girl rescued a stray German shepherd during a storm, unaware that its owner was a reclusive millionaire who would develop profound feelings for her. Emma, do not take the shortcut tonight. I insist, Liv cautioned. The storm was intensifying rapidly. Emma clutched the phone tightly between her shoulder and cheek, squinting through the rain-drenched windshield. Her knuckles were pale on the steering wheel, and the wipers struggled to cope with the incessant downpour. I have no alternative, Liv, she responded, her voice strained. My gas tank is nearly empty. If I take Due to the highway conditions, I will not return home. I will pull over, summon a cab, and stay elsewhere. Avoid the old road near the forest as it floods. Emma observed the illuminated red fuel indicator on her dashboard. Her car sputtered in apparent descent. I will be fine. It is merely a 10-minute drive. I will call you as soon as I arrive. However, the call was disconnected due to a lack of signal. Excellent. The storm outside raged like a furious beast, and the thunder resonated so intensely that it seemed the sky might fracture. The narrow country road ahead was slick, bordered by swaying trees that buckled under the force of the wind. Her headlights pierced the deluge, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Then, she heard it. A sharp, desperate bark followed by a low, pained whine. Emma abruptly applied the brakes. The tires skidded slightly before the vehicle halted. Heart racing, she leaned forward and gazed into the darkness, her breath misting the glass. There it was again, another bark, broken and feeble, not far from the roadside. She rolled down the window slightly. The rain struck her face, immediately cold and relentless, but the sound was now more distinct, no longer mere barking or whimpering. Something or someone was injured. Hello, she called into the darkness, uncertain of whom she anticipated would respond. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the trees, revealing a dark figure hunched in the ditch, shivering, soaked, and lying on its side. Without hesitation, Emma exited the car, pulling her hoodie over her head, though it offered little protection against the deluge. She splashed through puddles, slipping slightly in the mud as she approached the figure. As she approached, her heart ached for the German shepherd, a large and noble creature now quivering from cold and suffering. Its left front leg was contorted at an unnatural angle, and its fur was encrusted with mud and blood. Despite its evident distress, the dog refrained from growling or barking, instead gazing up at her with wide, soulful eyes that glimmered even in the darkness. Oh my God, she whispered, crouching beside it. Hey, you're okay now. I've got you. The dog whimpered once more, attempting to elevate its head. Emma extended her hand slowly, allowing it to sniff her damp palm. When the shepherd did not recoil, she positioned her arms beneath its body, gritting her teeth against its weight, which was greater than anticipated. The rain intensified as she struggled back to the car, cradling the injured dog like an infant. Her jeans were thoroughly soaked, and her shoes squelched with each step. By the time she opened the back door and gently placed the dog on the seat, she was shivering as well. She then leapt into the driver's seat, her teeth chattering and hands trembling. Trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline and cold, she gazed at the dog in the rearview mirror. It was curled up, breathing shallowly, its eyes fixed on hers. I don't know who you are, she murmured, but you're not dying out here, not tonight. The gaslight flickered again as she re-entered the road, driving more slowly now, one eye on the shepherd behind her. Perhaps it had an owner, perhaps it did not, perhaps it was dangerous, but none of that mattered in the moment. She could not leave it there. She would not in the midst of the storm. The night was tumultuous, shrouded in darkness, and the world seemed oblivious to its remaining salvations. Emma was unaware that her modest act of kindness, stopping in the rain to rescue a dog, would irrevocably alter her existence. She did not realize that beneath the tempest, the shattered bones, and the terrified whimpers resided a secret that would dismantle her understanding of love, loss, and redemption. All she comprehended was her resolute determination to not abandon that dog, neither in the rain, nor in the storm, nor at any time. The tempest persisted until dawn. By the time Emma ascended 3 flights of stairs with the injured German shepherd to her modest studio apartment, she was drenched and fatigued. However, as she delicately placed him on an aged quilt and observed his breathing stabilize, She realized she would repeat the ordeal without hesitation. She utilized every towel at her disposal to dry him, enveloping his injured leg in one. "You're all right now," she murmured. "Just hold on." The environment was confined and modest, furnished with second-hand items and a flickering stove. However, for the injured dog nestled at her feet, it could have been a sanctuary. Emma remained awake throughout the night beside him, observing the rise and fall of his chest in harmony with the gentle hum of the radiator. "Storm," she whispered eventually, stroking his damp fur. "That is your name now, for you arrived to me amidst the storm." The following morning, the veterinarian confirmed that his front leg was fractured. However, he was otherwise healthy. He lacked a collar, microchip, or tags. Emma disseminated photographs across various lost pet forums, printed flyers, and visited local shelters. Days elapsed without any calls, and thus Stormy remained. He healed gradually, moving from room to room with quiet elegance. He did not bark or whine, merely observed as if he comprehended everything. He swiftly adapted to her routines, waiting by the door when she departed for work and somehow discerning the location of his treats. Once she discovered her worn-out slippers, he nudged them beside her. She positioned the couch precisely where it was required. There was an almost human quality to him. She endeavored to maintain emotional detachment, as he was not hers. Yet each day, without communication, intensified her struggle. In truth, she required him as well. Her days at the cafe were prolonged and exhausting. Nights, once solitary with only the hum of the refrigerator, were now accompanied by Stormy's quiet companionship. He trailed her like a shadow, resting his head on her lap during reruns of old sitcoms, and when she wept, he drew near until her tears ceased. She had never experienced such profound understanding. One steamy evening, after an exhausting double shift, she took him for a brief walk. The street was tranquil, illuminated by flickering lamps. As they approached a closed liquor store, a man staggered out of an alley, inebriated, slurring. "Got any change, sweetheart?" he inquired, approaching closer, while Emma tightened her grip on Stormy's leash. "No, sorry." The man's eyes narrowed. "You appear as though you could spare something." Before she could respond, Stormy emitted a low, resonant growl that reverberated through the air, causing the man to freeze. Stormy advanced, positioning himself between Emma and the threat, assertive yet not aggressive. The man muttered a curse under his breath and vanished into the darkness. Emma remained motionless, her heart racing. She gazed down at Stormy, who was now at ease, his tail wagging gently. "You protected me," she whispered, kneeling to caress his head. "You are brave and beautiful." "Boy." He licked her cheek once that night, wrapped in a blanket with Stormy curled beside her. Emma gazed at him, not as a stray or a guest, but as a permanent presence. She had not anticipated this, yet now she could not envision life without him, neither Stormy nor her storm-sent savior. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and Stormy's limp had nearly disappeared. The veterinarian indicated he was healing well, although he would require additional time before he could run without strain. However, today, beneath the soft gold of in the late afternoon heat, Stormy appeared altered, restless and alert, as if something beyond the sidewalks and fire hydrants, beckoned him. Emma had just turned the corner of Cedar and Mill Street when Stormy abruptly halted, ears pricked and tail rigid. "What is it, boy?" she inquired, tightening her grasp on the leash, and then he lunged, not violently, but with intent. He yanked forcefully, taking Emma down a tranquil side street she had never previously explored. "Storm," she yelled, half laughing, half struggling to keep pace. "Where are you transporting me?" They traversed deteriorating sidewalks and unruly hedges until they arrived at a towering wrought iron gate, ornate and rusted with age, partially ajar. Beyond it stood a mansion, or what remained of one. The dilapidated structure was enveloped in ivy and shadows, its once gray columns chipped and worn, and its windows obscured by years of dust. It appeared abandoned, reminiscent of a forgotten fairy tale. Stormy halted just beyond the gate, tail lowered yet wagging, gazing at the house. Emma surveyed the surroundings, stating, "Stormy, we shouldn't be here." At that moment, the door creaked open as an elderly man emerged onto the porch, clad in a gray vest and slacks reminiscent of a bygone era. His white hair was meticulously combed, yet his hands trembled slightly on the banister. He resembled a specter summoned by the house itself. "Who?" the man began, then halted abruptly, his gaze falling upon Stormy, the dog, which had also momentarily frozen. Time seemed to suspend. The man took a tentative step forward. "Knight," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Is it truly you?" Emma blinked. "Knight." The man was already descending the steps with wide eyes and a slightly open mouth. As if fearful of breathing, Stormy advanced cautiously, his ears pinned back. Then, in a motion that sent chills down Emma's spine, he positioned himself directly in front of the man, lifting his injured paw gently into the air. The man collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Oh, my boy," he choked out. "My brave, stubborn boy." Emma remained in stunned silence, feeling as though she had intruded upon someone else's memory. It took several minutes before the man. He composed himself, rose, wiped his face, and turned to Emma. "I am sorry," he said hoarsely. "You must think I'm mad. Please, would you come inside?" Emma hesitated, gazing at the imposing house behind him. "I promise it's safe," he added quickly. "I just want to hear how you found him." Something in his voice, fragile and profoundly sincere, convinced her, and she nodded. Inside, the mansion was dimly lit, yet surprisingly intact. The entry hall bore traces of former grandeur, a chandelier cloaked in dust, faded portraits lining the walls, and antique furnishings. Furniture draped in white cloths filled the room, while the air was imbued with the scent of antiquated books and a subtle floral note reminiscent of dried roses. The man guided her to a sunroom adorned with tall windows and worn velvet chairs, gesturing for her to take a seat before briefly departing. He returned with 2 cups of tea. "I am Wallace," he stated, settling into a chair opposite her. "I was the caretaker of this estate. I still am, I suppose." Emma nodded slowly. "I am Emma, and I have been referring to him as Stormy." Wallace offered a faint smile. "He always did love the rain." A pause ensued, after which Emma inquired, "Is his true name Knight?" Wallace affirmed. Yes, Knight was associated with Mr. Alexander Graves. The name resonated vaguely in Emma's recollection, prompting her to narrow her eyes. "I recognize that name." "You probably do," Wallace replied gently. "Years ago, Mr. Graves was ubiquitous in headlines, magazines, and tech journals. He established one of the largest private software companies in the nation and retired before reaching 40, becoming a self-made billionaire." Emma's jaw dropped. "You mean this house?" "Indeed," Wallace confirmed. "This was his sanctuary. He disappeared from public view 5 years ago. No one has seen him since." Wallace gazed into his tea, reflecting on the loss of his wife and daughter in a car accident caused by his driver losing control on a bridge during a storm. Knight, who was in the back seat with them, survived while they did not. Emma felt her breath catch as she observed Stormy Knight, now resting peacefully on the rug, seemingly recalling the events. Mr. Graves held himself accountable, Wallace noted, having shut everything down and refrained from communicating with the press or anyone outside this house for years, speaking only to me. Then one day, Knight vanished, and Alexander believed he would never see him again. Once more, Emma blinked, her heart aching. "I discovered him that night amidst a tempest." Wallace's eyes brimmed with tears again. Perhaps the storm had returned him to his rightful place. Emma gazed at Knight, their eyes locking, and in his gaze, she perceived more than a mere dog. She discerned memory, grief, loyalty, and something deeper. Wallace adjusted his vest and inquired, "Would you stay for a while, Mr. Graves? He deserves to see Knight again." Emma hesitated, uncertain of the man Alexander Graves had become, yet something suggested this was not merely a coincidence. The return of a lost dog marked the inception of a far more intricate and potentially exquisite journey. She acquiesced. "I will remain." The drawing room was serene upon his entrance. Emma sensed his presence before visually acknowledging him, a palpable force that enveloped the space akin to a winter gust, silent, piercing, and inescapable. Alexander Graves entered with the composure of one accustomed to authority, yet he exuded a haunting stillness. Tall and slender, attired in a black button-up shirt and dark trousers, he appeared entirely unlike The technology magnate Emma had previously observed on vintage magazine covers. Wallace later revealed his hair was interspersed with gray, and his face had become more angular, with sharp contours shaped by loss rather than time. However, it was his eyes that captivated her most. They were a frigid blue, encircled by weariness, yet imbued with profound, subdued pain. When those eyes fell upon Knight, curled at Emma's feet, Alexander froze, his breath caught, and his jaw tightened. "Knight," he uttered, scarcely above a whisper. The dog gradually lifted his head and then stood, limping yet resolute, taking several deliberate steps forward. Toward Alexander, Emma briefly considered that Knight might rush into his embrace, but he halted midway. He gazed up at his former master, then turned to Emma, seemingly awaiting something, perhaps permission. Alexander knelt, murmuring, "You returned, after all this time." Knight approached, nuzzling Alexander's hand, but lacking the exuberant joy typically exhibited by dogs reuniting with their owners. This interaction was distinct, gentle, tentative, a delicate truce between the past and the present. Alexander swallowed hard, stating, "I didn't." Emma contemplated whether she deserved to see him again, uncertain about remaining or exiting. Knight, however, did not withdraw, positioning himself between them, his body oriented toward Alexander while his gaze frequently returned to her. Wallace entered quietly, offering Emma a subtle nod to remain seated. After a few moments of silence, Alexander stood and faced her. "You found him?" he inquired. Emma affirmed, explaining that he was lying injured in a ditch amidst pouring rain, and she could not abandon him. Her voice was calm, yet remote. "You are the first person to traverse that. It has been years since I believed anyone noticed this house," Emma remarked softly. "Your dog brought me here." Alexander looked at her, his expression inscrutable. He had departed on the anniversary, specifically, the third anniversary, of his wife and daughter. Emma's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she remained silent, sensing that he required her to do so. "I drove that night," he continued, his voice low. "It was late. They were fatigued. I believed we could reach home more swiftly by taking the bridge. The storm was more severe than I had anticipated. The car spun out, and they were gone in an instant." His fingers trembled at his sides, yet he remained seated. Knight was in the back seat. He clawed his way out of the wreckage and sat by the road for hours until someone discovered him. He never left my side after that, until that anniversary, when he vanished. Emma swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You thought he abandoned you as retribution." Alexander's gaze shifted toward her. There was no anger, only unvarnished truth. Silence enveloped the room once more, yet this time it felt denser. Emma glanced down at Knight, who had returned to her side, resting his head on her foot, his eyes half closed. "I believe he could no longer endure the pain," she murmured. "Perhaps he required space, just as you did." Alexander observed her intently for a prolonged moment before advancing and kneeling beside Knight. "Thank you," he expressed, directing his gratitude towards her rather than the dog, his voice slightly faltering. Emma offered a faint smile. "He did the same for me." She stood, brushing her palms against her jeans. "I should leave." Knight swiftly lifted his head, watching her, and Alexander nodded slowly. "You've done more than enough. I will make arrangements." However, before he could complete his thought, Knight rose and approached Emma, gently pressing his body against her leg. When she took a step back, he followed her gaze. At Alexander's wide-eyed gaze, I sensed his reluctance to remain. He fixated on the dog, then on her. His previously cold and inscrutable expression transformed, revealing confusion, pain, and a fragile glimmer of hope that had long been absent. "I haven't seen him like this in years," he murmured. Not since Emma knelt beside Knight, caressing the fur behind his ears. "Perhaps he is not choosing between us. Perhaps he simply understands where he belongs, at least for now." Alexander lowered his gaze, nodding. For the first time in 5 years, someone had traversed beyond the confines of his sorrow, not to remedy it nor to lament it, but to comprehend it, and Knight, his steadfast and injured companion, had guided her there. Initially, the invitations were tentative, a note discreetly placed beneath her apartment door from Wallace, a subtle entreaty for her and Knight, affectionately referred to as Stormy by Emma, to visit. Subsequently, more invitations followed, and soon Sunday afternoons evolved into a ritual. Emma would arrive bearing a modest basket of muffins or banana bread, with Stormy leading the ascent up the grand steps, as if he were entitled to do so, which he was, and Wallace would. She opened the door with a gentle smile, while Alexander Graves awaited in the sunroom, akin to a man gradually reacquainting himself with existence. Emma refrained from probing too deeply, never exceeding the boundaries of his disclosures. She did not endeavor to mend him. Instead, she consistently presented her warmth, her narratives, and a laughter that reverberated through the desolate corridors like a breeze stirring neglected drapes. In the most subtle manner, she revitalized that aged residence. One week, she came bearing a tray of lemon bars and she suggested a potted plant for the front steps, positioning it beside the fractured marble. It's called creeping thyme, a resilient species that thrives in various conditions. Alexander raised an eyebrow, inquiring, "Is that a subtle metaphor, Miss Emma?" She smiled, brushing soil from her hands. During another visit, she observed ivy suffocating the garden paths and dedicated 3 hours to uprooting vines and repositioning toppled bird baths. Wallace assisted her while Alexander observed from the veranda, a book resting in his lap, though he never truly read it. One afternoon, she discovered the antiquated piano, nestled in a room adjacent to the library, exhibited a warped cover and keys that were dusty and yellowed. "I was unaware you possessed this," she remarked, gliding her fingers over the ivory. Alexander lingered in the doorway, stating, "It belonged to my wife." Emma refrained from requesting to play it. Yet a week later, upon her return, the room had been tidied, the piano tuned, and a solitary stool positioned beside it. She performed a gentle, languorous piece that resonated with a sense of healing. Gradually, Alexander underwent a transformation. He resumed writing, and Emma caught fleeting glimpses of his journals. The patio table was cluttered with disorganized pages filled with hastily written notes and lines of prose, resembling confessions. He smiled more frequently and laughed occasionally. One day, while trimming hedges together, Wallace remarked, "He hasn't opened those windows in years, you know, until you." However, Emma was not merely providing illumination, she was also absorbing it. One golden afternoon, as Stormy napped at their feet beneath the willow tree in the backyard, Emma recounted her story to Alexander. "I aspired to be a veterinarian," she said, sipping tea from a chipped floral mug. "That was always the dream." Alexander gazed at her with fascination. "What transpired?" "My mother succumbed to cancer when I was 11. Thereafter, our lives unraveled." She offered a slight shrug. "I achieved commendable grades and exerted considerable effort, yet my scholarship applications were met with continual rejections, lacking connections, legacy, or a compelling narrative to captivate them. Just my perseverance amidst poverty." "You do not appear to be one who surrenders easily," Emma remarked with a laugh. I concurred. "I never have, nor do I now. However, aspirations become costly, and life burdensome. Thus I work as a waitress to cover expenses and endeavor to suppress my thoughts." Alexander remained silent for an extended period. "I apologize," he said gently. "You deserved better." She shrugged once more, though her eyes shimmered. "It is what it is." However, that evening, after Emma departed and the house fell silent, something awakened within him. Alexander sat at his desk late into the night, revisiting accounts he had neglected for years. He explored alumni foundations, school boards, and scholarship funds. He composed emails, made discreet calls, and ultimately established a new scholarship under a pseudonym, anonymous and inconspicuous, entitled The Knight. A legacy grant is designated for students devoid of familial ties or connections, relying solely on hope and determination. He included his own name in the nomination list, Emma Hayes. He never disclosed this to her. Days turned into weeks, and Emma continued to visit, bringing blueberry scones, reading aloud from a cherished novel, and planting roses by the front gate. Stormy roamed the yard freely, limping less frequently and barking joyfully at birds and butterflies. Alexander, who had previously concealed his heart behind iron gates in silence, found himself observing her increasingly, not merely with curiosity, but with deeper interest. With a profound reverence and a subtle ache, one morning, Wallace discovered him on the balcony, hands in pockets, observing Emma through the garden window as she softly sang while tending to a row of herbs. "She has restored the light," Wallace remarked gently. Alexander nodded. "I never anticipated witnessing it again." "She perceives you as well," Wallace continued. "Not the billionaire, not the recluse, but simply you." Alexander remained silent, yet a subtle softness emerged in his gaze. Suddenly, the rain descended, thick, cold, and furious, reminiscent of the storm from weeks prior. Emma was in the library, positioning a newly framed photograph of Stormy on the side table when she detected the low murmur of voices emanating from down the hall. She had not intended to eavesdrop. She merely followed the sound. Alexander's voice was steady yet serious, accompanied by another deeper voice, calm and professional, stating that the transfer should proceed. By the month's conclusion, the man stated that the trust would remain anonymous unless otherwise decided. "No," Alexander replied. "She cannot know. Not now. Not yet." Emma halted at the threshold, her stomach in knots. "Are you certain she will qualify?" the lawyer inquired. "She will. She is brilliant and determined. She merely requires someone to believe in her, even if that someone is her silent benefactor." There was a pause before Alexander responded, almost inaudibly. "She brought my dog home. She restored my life. This is the least I can do, Emma." She stepped back, her heart racing and her chest constricted. Without hesitation, she moved swiftly down the hall, retrieved her coat from the hook by the door, and slammed it shut behind her. Stormy barked from the kitchen, startled, but Emma did not pause. The rain struck her like a deluge the moment she exited, yet she remained indifferent, quickening her pace before breaking into a run. The tears in her eyes were indistinguishable from the rain, cascading down her face. She felt foolish, exploited. So this was the reality behind the muffins, the music, the garden. Laughter. Was it merely a mechanism for him to alleviate his self-reproach? Was she simply another entry in his ledger? Suddenly, the front door swung open. "Emma," Wallace called, his voice obscured by the rain, yet she did not respond. Moments later, Storm burst through the door, leash trailing behind him, barking vehemently. "Emma," Wallace exclaimed once more, "please wait." However, she was already halfway down the road when Stormy caught up, bounding beside her and whining as he attempted to nudge her leg, imploring her to halt. "Go back," she sobbed, "just go back." Upon reaching the corner, the street ahead was slick with water, her vision blurred. Her foot struck the edge of the curb. She did not see the car, but Stormy did. With a sudden burst of motion, he lunged in front of her, his body colliding with hers just enough to push her backward. The impact was abrupt and jarring. The car screeched, swerved, and clipped Stormy. Emma screamed as everything slowed. She stumbled backward, struck the wet pavement, and then experienced nothingness. The world spun once before going black. The first thing she perceived was the pale blue curtain swaying gently from the air vent above, followed by the soft beeping of the monitor beside her. Then she heard her name. She turned her head slowly, wincing as pain radiated across her temple. The voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably his, Alexander. He sat in the chair beside her bed, hands clasped tightly between his knees, shoulders hunched forward. The weight of the world bore down upon him. His typically tidy hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed and fatigued. "Alexander," her voice trembled. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "You're awake," he exhaled, his gaze scanning her face as if to confirm her presence. "Thank God," she replied, blinking in confusion. What happened?" "There was an accident," he stated softly. "You lost consciousness on the street and sustained a mild concussion, but you are fine." Her eyes widened. "Storm Knight. Where is he located?" Alexander smiled through a fresh sheen of tears, resilient as ever. The veterinarian assured that he would recover, despite his leg being in a cast. Wallace was with him now. Emma exhaled shakily and reclined against the pillows, relief washing over her like a tide. A prolonged silence ensued, with neither of them speaking. Eventually, Alexander stepped closer, his voice quivering. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and I need you to truly listen." She turned her head, their eyes locking. He exhaled. "I did not establish the scholarship to purchase your loyalty or your affection. I undertook this endeavor because you merit the future you envisioned. you would have achieved it with or without my assistance. I merely sought to alleviate the burden. Emma's eyes glimmered. I spent years attempting to atone for the past, believing that if I immersed myself in silence, I would ultimately feel less culpable. He paused, his voice softening. But you brought illumination to a place I presumed would remain in darkness. Tears brimmed in Emma's eyes. I do not solely wish to assist you in returning to school, he stated. I desire for you to remain. I want you to be an integral part of whatever life I have departed from you, and during the night, I yearn to hear your laughter echoing in the halls. I desire to witness your garden flourish each spring, to hear the piano resonate, and I want you to understand that my feelings are not born from a sense of obligation. He moved closer, placing his hand gently over hers. It is because I have fallen in love with you, Emma. Her breath caught. She gazed at him, eyes wide and lips parted. Alexander chuckled softly, shaking his head. I am aware of my age, and I recognize that my life is a labyrinth of sorrow and specters. Yet I also know that this house has not felt like a home for 5 years. Until you entered, Emma blinked, tears cascading down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought you were attempting to control everything. I didn't comprehend. She swallowed, her voice faltering. I've never had anyone believe in me like that. I didn't know how to manage it. Alexander gently squeezed her hand. You need not apologize, just remain. Emma chuckled softly through her tears. Are you certain? You'll be burdened with a partially broken college student, a dog with a limp, and a herb garden that refuses to thrive. Alexander exhibited a smile. His lips curled with a tender sincerity. That sounds like everything I have ever desired. She grasped his hand, drawing it to her chest. I wish to remain as well, she murmured. In that hushed hospital room, illuminated by sterile lights and accompanied by the gentle beeping of machines, 2 fractured hearts rediscovered their harmony. Outside, the rain had ceased, and further down the corridor, a German shepherd with a cast on its leg barked softly, joyfully, as if it already understood the conclusion. 3 years later, the garden behind the Graves estate had, once ensnared by vines and shadows, the area has now flourished with roses, lavender, sunflowers, and the gentle hum of life. Birds chirped among the towering oaks, the fountain resumed its melody, and the house, once silent, now resonated with laughter, music, and the soft footsteps of a dog named Stormy. Emma stood beneath the willow tree, one hand delicately resting on Stormy's back, while the other held her graduation cap. His fur had grayed slightly, and his legs remained stiff from the accident, yet his spirit was undaunted. She smiled. Dr. Emma Hayes, DVM, the scholarship recipient of Stormy Light Foundation, had supported her, but it was only in her final year that she discovered the truth. Alexander had established it in Knight's honor. She looked down at Stormy and whispered, "We made it, boy." Behind her, the screen door opened with a familiar creak as Alexander stepped into the sunlight, clad in a light gray suit, his hair slightly longer and his expression softer. In his hands, he held a freshly printed book. I have something for you, he said. Emma raised an eyebrow, questioning whether it was yet another self-help bestseller. He smiled, not quite. She took the book and began to read. The title was read aloud, When the Rain Brought Her Home. Inside the front cover was a dedication to the girl who returned my dog and captured my heart upon her departure. For Emma, my light in the storm. Emma's eyes were filled with tears as she whispered, "You keep making me cry," smiling despite her emotions. Alexander grasped her hand, replying, "You make it easy." Wallace called from the terrace, "They're here. Everyone is ready." Emma, breathless, responded, "Are you certain about this?" She jested, "You are marrying someone who converses with dogs more than with humans?" He grasped her hand and remarked, "You are marrying someone who once believed that silence could conceal sorrow. We will resolve this." She chuckled as the music commenced. The ceremony was intimate, attended by friends, several professors, neighbors, and Wallace, who stood proudly at the rear with a handkerchief in hand. Petals adorned the garden path beneath a delicate white arch, yet the moment everyone. Stormy entered the aisle, adorned with a diminutive bow tie and a ribbon around his neck, bearing 2 gold rings, eliciting soft chuckles from the guests as he faithfully halted beside Alexander. Subsequently, Emma emerged in a flowing lace dress, radiating strength and joy derived not from comfort, but from resilience. Upon her arrival, Alexander murmured, "You take my breath away." She smiled. "Good, you'll need it for the vows." Their voices quivered, their promises anchored in collective suffering, love, and restoration. When the rings were exchanged, Stormy emitted a proud bark, affirming the moment with exuberance. Following the ceremony, guests meandered through the flourishing garden, sipping lemonade while music resonated beneath the ancient oak. Wallace sat on the veranda, his eyes misty, as Stormy approached and gently rested his head on Wallace's knee. The old man smiled down at him before turning his gaze toward Alexander and Emma, who were dancing beneath the willow, her laughter resonating like wind chimes. "You resurrected him, did you not, boy?" Wallace whispered to Stormy, who wagged his tail in response. He was truly revitalized in a house that had once been engulfed in silence. Laughter now resonated in a garden that had previously been desolate with sorrow. Love had taken root deeply in the heart of a man who had once been lost. A girl and a dog had cultivated something enduring. Hope. Sometimes, the storms in our lives do not arrive to devastate us. They come to clear the way for something beautiful. Emma believed she was merely rescuing a stray dog that night, but in reality, Stormy saved them all, bridging the hearts of two solitary individuals who had nearly lost the essence of feeling alive, reveal that love can re-emerge through the most unforeseen paths. If this narrative resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories, where we present tales that heal, inspire, and remind us of the subtle magic still present in the world. We look forward to your presence in the next story.